everyone, and welcome to Minnesota Statewide's panel entitled Perspectives on Inequality. We're talking about inequality today. It's an issue that's always been present and always will be to some extent. It underpins a lot of the other social and economic issues that we discuss and care about. There are many different types, including economic, racial, gender, etc. The U.S. is unique. Despite attempts at equal opportunity, income and wealth inequality is rising and is higher than most other developed countries. And many experts attribute that in part to the history of slavery and racism. So today we have two panelists who are going to discuss different aspects of inequality. We'll have them each speak for 15 minutes or so, and we'll take some questions. And after that, we'll have a social where we can relax and catch up. Speakers today are Connie Tsosie de Haro, International Executive Board Member at Large, or Secretary now. I got to update my notes here. And Robert E. Reading Alumni Chapter. And we also have Jesse Bulluck, District 25 Alumni. Danny Leader had something come up and is unable to make it today. So I'll let them each introduce themselves briefly and then we'll get into it. Let's start with Connie.
Tsosie de Haro, hello, my name is Tsosie de Haro. I am of the Water's Edge clan, born for the red running into the water. My maternal grandfather's clan is one who walks around you, and my paternal grandfather's clan is also Water's Edge. And that's traditionally how we introduce ourselves in Navajo. So it's a pleasure to meet all of you, and I am your International Secretary for this biennium. Jesse, go right ahead.
Thank you, Connie. Good afternoon. My name is Jesse Bulluck, and I am coming to you from Eastern North Carolina, where I serve as a first grade teacher, attorney, to talk about issues that I see within our education system.
Right. Thanks, Jesse. So let's get into it, and then we'll take some questions. Let's start with Connie, if you're ready.
Sure. So I think this is an interesting topic because when we start thinking about inequality, we mostly think about like this disparity, right? The disparity between distribution or opportunities that are available for different members of our current society. And I think that one thing that we don't really think about is we think about it like in a general sense, right? Like this 20,000 foot level view of what does this mean to our society in a general sense, in a general way. But when we start looking at a more granular level, like how does that affect all these different populations? And that's the type of work that I do. So I currently serve as counsel for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. All of my opinions are of my own. None of them have anything to do with the committee or the senators that I work for or anything like that. But part of my job is looking at how different things affect different populations on that granular level that I was discussing. So for me, my primary focus is on the Native American tribes in the United States. And sometimes my work does take into consideration the international indigenous populations as well, especially when it comes to border issues. But when we think about inequality, two things that really stand out to me, not only as a Native woman, but also when I'm working and advocating on behalf of our tribes, one thing that really stands out to me is how there is a very big economic inequality when it comes to the Native populations of our country. And by economic inequality, I'm not just talking about, personal wealth. I think it's very clear that you can just do some simple Googling and you'll see that there is a lot of issues when it comes to reservations and when it comes to just even trying to get a job. For example, like where I'm from, my tribe has one of the largest land base, largest reservation land bases in the country. And it's very rural, and jobs are very difficult to find because there are a lot of additional issues that come along with accessing a job. So I'm going to have all of you participants take a few moments, close your eyes and think about your everyday life when you're going to work. What does that require for you? That means, getting a good night's sleep, having something to eat or drink in the morning, getting to work, whether that be a car or public transportation, and then being able to work comfortably. And then you think about your commute home. And then you get home and having access to food, and then being able to get some more sleep at the end of, resting at the end of your day. Those are issues that you don't normally think about on a day-to-day basis. But where I'm from, you have to think about all of those issues and every step of the way. So when you're having access to housing is a huge issue. With a lot of tribal people, you have to make sure that they are having adequate housing, because a lot of those are written within our treaty rights, which is a whole other conversation for a different day. But having, accessing comfortable housing and making sure that you have adequate housing and that it's sustainable housing, or making sure that you have access to a vehicle so you can get to a job. And not a lot of people have those resources, especially when you're traveling long distances. So for example, like where I'm from, I live in a more populated area of the Navajo Nation, but so there was a time where I had to work in Gallup, New Mexico, which is about a 30-minute drive away. And I probably wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't have a car, because then I would have to walk to work every day, which was something that my grandpa did, where he would have to walk at least 15 miles to work every day just to make a living for his family. And then he would walk home every evening. So it's those types of things that when we're thinking about inequality and economic inequality, we have to think about what it means at a more local level and what are the potential solutions that we can do to make sure that everybody has access to the proper resources to not only support their families, but to also contribute to an economy and make sure that economy is not only sustainable, but that it's also, going to be productive and that it'll provide everything that you need. And I think that's something that we all have to think about as people who are all living on this same planet. And then also part of that economic inequality is also the racial inequality. So I think that the more difficult conversation to have about racial inequality for me is reminding people that the indigenous people of this country still exist. And you can hear a lot of these very interesting comments when it comes to talking about the Native people of our country. So once again, have you all close your eyes? Maybe you're not closing your eyes. I don't know, but I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and just imagine, like, what do you see when you think of a Native person? You don't have to share, it's fine. But more often than not, you have a very stereotypical image of what a Native person looks like. And that's all based off of what popular media is giving you. And so that's something that we all need to examine within ourselves, is how do we view each other, especially how do we view the indigenous people of this country, which is when we're going to be talking about addressing all these different disparities, we need to make sure that we are including our indigenous people in those conversations, because too often they are left out of those conversations, and too often there are decisions that are being made for them along with other groups as well. But these decisions that are being made are not including a perspective that needs to be taken into a lot of consideration, because a lot of indigenous tribes have very different ways of how to address different things. And it's so important that we make sure that we're having those conversations with those people, because it is incredibly important that not only are we having different solutions for different groups, but we're having different solutions for different tribes. Because stuff that, for example, like in my tribe, there's things that we do that are just not, that are considered, taboo for other tribes. And that's just the way it is. And it's the same for a lot of different, groups and religions and other things like that. So when we're having these conversations and when we're thinking about how are we going to make sure that we are not only incorporating different points of view, but how are we making sure that we are looking and being inclusive of Indigenous people? And that's something that we all have to take a really long, hard look at. And it's incredibly difficult to do that, because when you start realizing that a lot of what you're thinking about what it means to be an Indigenous person and what it means, what that history means here for the United States, like how do you play a part in that? And how can you make sure that moving forward, you're going to have a more well-rounded view of what Indigenous people in this country do and what it means to be an Indigenous person here. I could go on and on and on about all of that, but I'm going to give a quick pause and turn it over to Jesse. So Jesse, go ahead, take it away.
Jesse, do we have you on video?
Hey, let me check back in. Is that better?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, awesome. Again, apologies for switching out really quickly there. If my internet gets a little spotty, just let me know and I can try turning off my camera to save some bandwidth. But good afternoon again. I want to follow up on something that I heard Connie say, which really stood out to me, and that was representation matters. And so I'll give you a little bit of my history and why that phrase stuck out to me. So as most of you may know or may not know, I served as an attorney for about 10 years. And within the last year or two, I decided to make a transition into the field of education, which was something that I've always been passionate about. And I finally had the opportunity to sort of make that move into the classroom space. And so I did two things. One, I started a PhD program. So I'm getting my PhD in educational policy. And then I became a teacher. And so my first year teaching, I served as a kindergarten teacher. And this year is my first year teaching first grade. So I got a chance to move up with my students from last year. And the reason why I say representation matters and it stood out to me is because I am the only male who is on the first grade team. I'm only one of 3 males who are teaching in the primary school, who serve as a lead teacher in the primary grade. So that's kindergarten through 4th grade. And then I am, the 3 males who are teaching, we are all 3 Black males as well. And that matters because our school is about 95% African-American Black students. And so for them to see a Black male in the classroom is sort of a different image for them. It's something that's outside of the norm. But they get the opportunity to see a professional standing in front of the classroom who is instructing them. And it sort of just changes their mindset and how they feel about Black men. And especially for my young Black men in my classes, they get to see something that's possible. They get to see an image that is positive. Last year when I started teaching, one of the things I noticed were the young men. They would walk down the hallway, and a lot of them, they would just look up at me, and then over time they would just start waving and smiling at me. And these are kids who were not in my class, so they didn't have a clue as to who I was, but they just knew that they saw somebody who looked like them in their classroom, in a classroom. And so now I get to sort of cultivate those relationships, not only with my students in my class, but with all the first grade students. And I find that it's very rewarding. I definitely can see the change in them. And I believe that it will give them something to aspire towards as they continue on their educational journey. But as we're talking about inequality, and like I said, I specifically look at the area of education. One of the things that I find now being in the classroom is we hear a lot about how schools are funded and sort of how this funding is not fair. Schools generally rely on tax revenue in the local area that they're in. And so we know that different areas have different ranges of taxes. And so that shows up in the school systems and what financial resources are available. And the ways that shows up in the classroom, I can tell you, it shows up in the way of not having enough materials for your students. I can tell you that it's very frustrating when you're trying to teach and you don't have enough books for each kid to have a copy. And so you're having to try to figure out how we can share this book and I can get each kid to practice reading. It shows up in not having enough computers for all your students. And so you're having to try to figure out how you can have your class on the computers while you're engaging in another activity with the other half of your class, and then kind of switching them off just so that each child gets the opportunity to have that computer time and that time with technology to build up their skills. Other ways that it shows up, and that are probably a little bit more significant, is in your ability to hire teachers and staff. So of course, we know that teachers, in my opinion, are the backbone of the system. You need them there. And when you can't hire enough teachers for your classrooms, then you end up with classes that have 20 plus students or 25 plus students. And I can tell you, once you start approaching 20 students, it becomes a lot to handle inside the classroom. Ideally, you would love to have classrooms that are about 15 to 17 students. That's about as much as one person can handle without having an assistant. And so talking about inequality, that's what I mean by being able to hire staff. Most schools don't have the resources to hire those additional staff members, which would be your teacher assistants or your counselors or other paraprofessionals who are needed within the school system. And that can have a huge impact, a significant impact on your ability to educate your students or provide them with the services that they need to advance from grade to grade. And so those are the things that stand out to me. And like I said, now as I'm in the classroom, I get to have that sort of personal observation and feel how others have felt for so long when they've been, speaking about these issues. And so I'm happy to kind of answer questions as they come up. I'll throw in just a little bit more. I am located in Eastern North Carolina, which is rural. So very small town. Just think a country town with like one stoplight. That's where we're located. And so one of the reasons why I'm excited to be at the school that I'm at is because I grew up here in this area. So my school is like 10 minutes away from my house that I grew up in. And so this is something that I often remind my students and my parents about, because I want them to understand and to know that, you have someone who is from where you're from. I understand a lot of the struggles and challenges that we face on a daily basis because I had to deal with those things 20 years later. But I want them to know what's available to them and what opportunities they can have. Even though we're from a rural area that is economically depressed, we can still go and achieve great things. It takes a lot of work, but it is definitely possible. And so, like I said, I'm an attorney. So one of the things I had my students do, and some people kind of laughed at it, but I wanted my students to start developing those skills early. So I actually had a speech and debate in my class with my first graders, my 6-year-olds, and we were voting on something. So I took them through the voting process, and then I had them come up and give speeches. And ask follow-up questions and actually debate the things that we were voting on. And this is just one of those skills where I thought this is an opportunity for my students to, one, learn about public speaking, and also start developing those argumentative skills that I know will be very beneficial to them later on down the line. And so, again, feel free to ask questions. I'm happy to answer them.
All right, Connie, do you have more you want to say, or should we move to questions?
I'm an attorney. I always have more to say.
All right, go ahead.
But I think it's, so I was just thinking about what Jesse was saying, and I really was able to condense my rambling into just one perfect phrase, which was representation matters. And that's why he's a teacher and I work in Congress. So, but I think that's so important. And I mean, that's ultimately, I think, the biggest point that I was trying to get at, which was that representation does matter. And now you can see that there is a huge shift in making sure that there is representation, especially when it comes to Indigenous people. You can see that now with, what's going on in popular culture and on television shows. And it's such a dramatic shift and it's so different. And I'm so glad that these changes are happening, because I hear it from a lot of Native youth that they did not see themselves being able to be on TV or to be doing these amazing social media things, or even just doing something as simple as like having a Native teacher. Like when to circle back to what Jesse was saying, when my mom, who's also a teacher, first started teaching, she came home and she was one of 5 Navajo teachers on the entire reservation at that time. And this was like back in 1979. So it makes a huge difference. And the impact that she's had on not only my life, but on who knows how many kids after that, they always come back to her and they say thank you with the skills that she was able to teach them, and that the cultural knowledge that she carries and passing that on to them, it's so important and it matters. And I'm so glad that Jesse was able to say all that in such a more eloquent way than I ever could. But also I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any, either now or later on. I'm always around. So that's it.
I thought you both spoke very eloquently. Jesse, anything to build off of that?
Not too much, but I definitely will highlight. We're kind of bouncing off of each other here, Connie, but I love the fact that you said, there is that shift. Earlier, was it this week or last week? My weeks are confused now. Last week, we were out for Indigenous Peoples Day. And as these holidays come up, one of the things that I am very intentional about is exposing the students to these days. So as we're celebrating Indigenous people, or we're celebrating Hispanic month, or we're celebrating any other holidays that come about, I'm making it my business to at least expose the students to it. Sometimes it's a little bit challenging to explain it to a 6-year-old, but I give my students the respect that they can understand what I'm telling them. So I don't try to, make it babyish or anything. Like, I just explain it to them. And as they have questions, I answer them to the best of my ability, or we search for an answer. But I want them to just at least be aware at this point, at this age. And then later on, as they grow, they can go into more in depth about it. But at least just exposing them, I think, is such a something that's needed. Because again, coming from a very rural area, they don't have that exposure. And so if they're not receiving it in school, chances are they're not going to get it at home or anywhere else. So I feel like it's my duty to at least give them that preview of, what's in our world, because I want them to become global citizens and sort of start learning these things so that once they become an adult, they can expand their options, because I don't want them to be limited to just staying around here.
Yeah, well, we can continue the conversation with questions, or feel free to jump in with comments.
Yes.
One thing I heard you both talk about is representation, and we've talked about a couple of discrete areas of inequality, and one that brings me to is the voting, access to voting, especially with the election coming up. So, and barriers to voting. So some of the things that Connie mentioned with getting to work, you need a car, you need adequate rest, you need food. A lot of those things are similar barriers to voting. Getting time off, taking time off from work, getting to the polling place. Sometimes there are long lines in some areas, and so I don't know if you wanted to comment further on that, but Connie said we all need to register to vote if we're not already. Good tip, make sure to do that.
Absolutely.
Another thing Jesse mentioned, the rural city divide, I thought was interesting, especially with pandemic, a lot of things being virtual. Access to Wi-Fi is a huge issue for students and for lawyers and clients. And I'm still doing a lot of things virtually, so it's nice to have that technological setup and kind of take it for granted being in the city, having Wi-Fi. So some people work from the beach or camping, and then they have their portable setup, but it can sometimes be hard to find different places.
So Corey, just to jump in right here to really demonstrate how significant that Wi-Fi issue is. So where I live, we've had Wi-Fi since we've moved here about 20 years ago. My grandmother's house, which is less than a mile down the road, Wi-Fi or the high-speed internet just became available, I want to say within the last 2 weeks. So that right there shows you what we deal with kind of in these rural spaces. And that can happen all over the county. It just so happens that our house was next to a railroad track. And so for some reason, they ran the high-speed internet line on the railroad track, but a mile down the road, and they could not get it. And it just became available within the last 2 weeks. My sister just said that they got a notice in the mail saying that it's available to them now. And so we still had people using dial-up in some spaces, if anything at all. And I know that sounds crazy in 2022, but that's the reality of things. Last year, or not last year, but the year prior, when we were still out of school for the pandemic, students were having to go to local establishments to try to use their Wi-Fi. One of the things the school systems, or the state rather, the governor of our state tried to do was have mobile vans go out to these kind of isolated areas so that students could use the Wi-Fi and complete their assignments. But the reality is, a lot of times we just had students who were not online. There were so many students who they did not attend class because they just did not have access, or if they had access, they had limited access. So maybe they had multiple children in the same household. Well, if you have 2 or 3 children who need to go to class, but you only have one computer, only one child is going to class that day. And so then you're still having children who are missing significant amount of time out of school. But yes, the Wi-Fi thing is really huge. I don't want to take up too much time, but I have another issue that's up here on my list as well to talk about.
Yeah, go for it.
So, Connie.
Unless Connie wanted to jump in on.
Yeah, come on jump in, Connie. We're just having an informal conversation.
I was just thinking, I was like, oh, voting, that's my jam. I'm like, oh, internet access, also my jam. Oh my gosh, you're getting me too excited. I don't like it. a lot
we
of
also
it,
got a comment from International Justice Nicole Grita. Living in Tennessee, there are many rural areas where access to reliable internet is an ongoing concern, as I'm
Yeah.
sure it is in much of the country. But yeah, go ahead, Connie, if you had more to say on either of those.
100%. A lot of what Jesse talked about is a lot of the same issues that a lot of tribal communities face. So one of the things that's super interesting is that there's not a whole lot of data on tribal communities. Yes, you have the census stuff, and yes, you have occasional researchers coming and studying and giving you these numbers, but it's not a complete accurate view of what's going on. So currently, right now, roughly about, now keep in mind, this is for all tribal areas, pretty big. About 66% of the households in all of Indian country, including Alaska Native areas, have access to the internet. That's not that great compared to the New York City, which is 87% of people have access to the internet. So the disparity with internet access is huge. And it's so important that you make sure that the data that you have and that you give is also correct, which brings me to the census. It's so important that you fill out the census. I know you're required by law, and I know nobody's going to come get you, but that data is so important, especially when it comes to making sure that a lot of federal funding is going to be given not only to your schools, but also to make sure that you just have access to internet. And just making sure that your data is in there, it does matter, just like your vote matters. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for because that's not my place. But I do know that as somebody who has been working on Native American voting rights for a very long time, that your vote, it matters, and your vote is so important. And that even if you think your vote doesn't count, it does. It wasn't until I started working for the federal government that I finally understood how important my vote is, because that made me realize how much of an impact my voice has, not only on a federal level, but also on a state and local level. So even if you think that you're not going to have an impact, you do, and it's huge. And a lot of what Corey talked about when it comes to accessing the ballot box, you have transportation problems, you have just trying to make sure that you even have a polling place in your community, and making sure that it's not on limited hours. And even for states that do voting by mail, you need a post office box, or you need a post office. And a lot of communities sometimes don't have those either. So that's why it is so important that you get out your vote. And if you are able to, that you are able to volunteer your time to help people vote. It is one of our given rights for us to exercise our power and our voice as citizens of this country. And coming from me, from someone who's a Native woman, who's had to work within a system that has been designed and set up for me to fail, and is saying this to you: get out and vote. And if you don't, I will ask you at convention and I will make you register. Okay, I'm done.
No, Connie, you have some really great stuff in there. And so I'm gonna do a few things here. Federal funding for education, we're gonna park that over. We call it, in school, we say we're gonna park it in the parking lot right now. I'm gonna come back to that. But just to kind of emphasize the things that Connie was talking about, transportation, huge issue in our rural areas. The polling places are miles away. You can't get to them. But one of the things we saw, at least in North Carolina, during the last few years, voting, limiting early voting to just a few days instead of it allowing it to be for, a few weeks like it was in the previous decade. Limiting the number of polling places to just one in the county, one in the entire county, but stretches from end to end. It could take you at least an hour or two to get from end to end in the county. And we just have one polling place now. And then also, what else did I say? One of the things you can do, she mentioned trying to be involved. We as attorneys, one of the things you can do is you can serve on the attorney hotline for the state. Is I've done that a few years, and I've also served as an attorney observer at the polling places during election season. It's something that you can do and utilize your legal knowledge to do as well. So I'll stop there. But yes, those were some very great points.
A lot of important issues. I will say I have my ballot here. I haven't filled it out yet, but if you're voting by mail, just make sure you postmark it on or before election day.
I do early voting, so I'll be voting, Connie. I think it starts in 2 days or something like that.
Yeah, it's different
Actually,
by state.
One of the great things about my school, they actually give us the afternoon off. They make it a short day for us so that we actually can go vote on election day.
That's good. I think election day should be a national holiday. It's still not going to help low wage workers that much, people without paid vacation, but I think it'll still help. One thing Connie brought up was the census, and I like numbers, so I was kind of looking at the census numbers earlier today from 2021, and they found that inequality increased. So you got the 10th percentile, the lowest 10% of household incomes, but they were at or below $15,660. And then the 90th percentile, the top 10% of household incomes, was above $211,956. So the ratio is 13.5. So it's 13.5 times from the top to the bottom. So it's that's a pretty big difference. Another thing I was kind of looking around at is the richest man in the world, richest person in the world right now is Elon Musk, a little over $200 billion in net worth. And that is almost 3 million times the median US household income. So that led me to a couple questions. Well, we're always going to have some level of inequality. There's no way to achieve perfect equality, but is inequality desirable? Is it, how much inequality can we tolerate, and are there things we should do to alleviate it? Thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So I actually want to push you a little bit, because the term inequality, it refers to, and now I'm speaking sort of from a educational perspective. This is something that we debate within sort of the education field. That term inequality, we don't necessarily care for it, because it speaks to resources and what is available to whatever entity you're providing those resources to. And so when we say things are unequal, we're just saying that, oh, these different populations are not receiving the same amount of resources. So we want to make things equal. We want to provide the same amount. So for instance, if we're providing $1,000 per pupil, then we're going to make sure that every pupil in whatever space we're looking at receives $1,000. But then the question is that fair? Is that adequate? Is that enough for those students, or again, whatever population you're referring to? So the term that we've been shifting more towards is equity. We want everything to be equitable. So equity looks at this idea of justice and bias and unfairness that may be present in the distribution of resources. And so when I say I want things to be equitable, I'm saying that in District A, $1,000 per student may be adequate. That may be enough for those students to get all of the resources they need to have an adequate education. But when I look at District B, those students may come from a disadvantaged background. They may come from, they may have challenges there in that district that necessitate having additional funds to get them on par with the other, their comparable districts. So they may need $1,500 per pupil to get them just to an equal playing field. So I'll push you a little bit just on using that term inequality. We want to kind of shift it towards inequity, or making things more equitable, because that then gets into the issues of what is fair and what should be to get people to the level that is equal to others. So again, in the education system, that may mean that we provide additional financial resources, or we provide some districts with teachers who are highly qualified and experienced, so that we can get their students to the levels they need to be at that we expect when they're taking these standardized tests, which is something else. Again, we'll put that in the parking lot with the whole federal funding thing, Connie.
I
You didn't
appreciate.
get me started. I'm glad you say equity, Jesse, because I think that's like a perfect way to describe like the type of work that we try to do. I'm going back to the broadband space because that's the best example I can think of right now, is where when we're talking about trying to make sure that tribal communities are able to have funding to have access to internet, broadband, wireless, satellite, however it needs to be, because different communities require different solutions. When we think about it, the needs for a tribe that's located a more metropolitan area is vastly different from a tribe that's a little bit more rural, like mine, or another tribe, you know, like in Alaska, who has very little infrastructure and very little ability to access the necessary equipment, and have a very, very, very limited window of when you can actually build out that infrastructure. So to make it equal would be giving them the same amount of money that we're giving these other entities to build out these broadband infrastructures. But part of that includes having them build up to the same level that Verizon, for example, is like utilizing. So the speed test for Verizon in a lot of areas is very high because they have the necessary infrastructure in place to ensure that not only is there going to be consistent access, but there's also going to be that very high level for your upload and downloads. If you do that for tribes, especially those in rural areas who do not have access to those speed levels, are able to get those speed levels, and you're imposing those same or similar requirements on them, the best illusion that I can make is having a Pinto use a Ferrari motor. It's just not going to work. You're having aging infrastructure. You try to get to these very high bandwidth upload and download speeds that are just not, that are going to crash your system, basically. You know, you're zooming along in your Pinto for maybe 2 miles, and then what do you know? You're on the side of the road. So I think that I'm glad that Jesse described it that way, because that's exactly what we're talking about. We can have everything be equal, but having equity and making sure that everybody has the proper things and the necessary things in place to make sure that you are going to be successful is like super important.
I say, Connie, I love that Pinto Ferrari example. And you can easily translate that into the class or the school building itself, because we have so many schools, especially in our rural areas, that are deteriorating. And it's because the rural counties, they don't have as many people, so they don't have as large of a tax base. So they're unable to sort of rebuild schools as often as they should be. So you do have schools that are, I think the school building that I went to high school at is the same building that my older sisters went to high school at. It's the same building that they built back in, actually they built that building probably right after Brown v. Board of Education. I'm not even lying. Like I come from one of those areas in North Carolina where the schools had to be combined. And so once that decision came down and they combined the school, that's when they built the new school. So it's been there that long. And, you know, who knows when they will ever have the opportunity to build an actual new high school. The time that I went through the school system, we had no middle school. There had not been a middle school, a physical middle school building for probably 2 decades. They finally built one when my younger sister started middle school. And so these are the types of issues that we deal with. And the buildings that we do have, to get back to Connie's example, you come in, you try to put some paint over sort of that old structure to make it look new, but it's still the old structure. You haven't changed anything about it. So yeah, you can slap a coat of paint on it. You can try to bring in a smart board and say that you've upgraded it, but really you haven't. And that matters because one of the things I did this summer was I did a research project with East Carolina University here in North Carolina. And we went out and interviewed students, teachers, families, staff at 3 of the local county school districts. And we talked to them about one of the learning programs that the governor is interested in learning more about. And so one of the things we asked them was, how do you like the building? How do you like the program? And a lot of the students, they voiced their concerns or their thoughts about the buildings that they had to attend school in. And I'm talking, these are kindergarten through 5th graders. And again, like I said, I give students that opportunity to voice, to say how they feel, to have a voice. Like that's one of the things, again, that I'm very intentional about because I want to develop those skills early on. I want them to have an opinion and I want them to know that their voice matters. And they express those very concerns that, Connie's talking about. So again, very important. Make sure you're voting. Make sure you're kind of staying abreast of these things.
Well, let's start talking about some solutions. So when we talk about equity, I mean, that's a good term to use when we're talking about solutions. So first, how do these issues come up and how do we resolve them? Are these structural issues that require structural solutions, or are they individual issues that require individual solutions? Or is it somewhere in between? Thoughts on that?
I think it's both, to be perfectly honest. I think that one phrase that stuck with me that stood out the most, I can't even remember what program it was I went to in high school, but we talked a lot about acting local and thinking global. So that can apply to really any sense of whatever you're trying to address. I also like to use, you can go out and do the work. Trust me, there's a lot of work out there that needs to be done. Jesse's talked a lot about what he's doing to make sure that, these kids are going to have such a well-rounded point of view, which is amazing. I wish I had that and I didn't. But I think that it has to start from within and it has to start on a local level and it has to start with you. It has to start with what I think the first step in a lot of these is addressing your own internal bias on how you think about things and how you view the world, because it is very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of other people, especially when you've grown up in such a way where you don't completely understand what it's like to be not only in that part of the world or even in that community or even in that culture, but going in with an open mind and being able to learn and to absorb all this information and to have the ability to humble yourself when you know that you are in an active learning space and that you are being cautiously a lot of the time welcome to a lot of these different communities. It's just being respectful. And a lot of that work takes place within your own self. And that internal work will translate into your outward work into the world. Hence the thinking global part. It transcends and it does make a huge impact on your work in the future, not only as attorneys or advocates, but even in your own interpersonal relationships. And one thing that it's so funny that this quote stands out to me right now. It's from Lauryn Hill. She says, how are you going to win when you ain't right with it? And that's very, very true. And that should really be something that all of us should think about as we're starting to take a more proactive step to addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially within our fraternity.
Connie, I love that. So now I'll take off my teacher's hat and I'll switch over to the academia side. So in the world of academia, what Connie just described, we call that sort of that internal bias that she's talking about. One of the things we try to do as researchers is sort of take a look at yourself, who you are, what made you who you are, the experiences you've had, because you bring all of that with you into the research space. And so, one of the assignments that we just completed for one of my classes is writing a positionality statement. And so, in a positionality statement, you take a look at your own bias, you take a look at your experiences and how they shape your research agenda. So, in looking at my own personal background, I had to think about what did it mean for me to grow up in a rural area? What did it mean for me to grow up in a single parent household with a mom? What did it mean for me to grow up as a Black man or as a Black boy? Now, and how does that show up now that I'm teaching? You know, like, how am I viewing my students? How am I viewing my male students? How am I viewing my female students? How am I viewing my students who come from a different racial background, who come from a different religious background, who come from different countries, and sort of just making sense of how I'm viewing the world and how I am going to sort of address my own bias that is within me as I'm trying to advance, my own research agenda. And so, like, in those positionality statements, you just make those declarative statements like, I acknowledge that I am a male and that I benefit from male privilege. But I also recognize that not only am I male, I'm a Black male. So while I may have male privilege, there are situations where my voice may be silenced just because of the way I look. You know, walking in a room, it happens. And as I said, as a male teacher in the primary grades, that's rare. It doesn't happen a lot of times. So I've had situations this year and last year when I started teaching where I will receive an email from somebody and they just assume I'm a female teacher. They just say, "Hey, good afternoon, Miss Bulluck." And I have to always kind of sort of correct them in a nice way, like, no, you know, I'm not a female teacher, I'm a male teacher, and I'm teaching the younger grades. Or people will say something like, "Oh, well, you may not know how to talk to the students." And it's kind of, you're just sort of like very dismissive, like fathers or males don't know how to be nurturing to young kids. It's those sort of things that you just have to be aware of, because they show up in your own personal internal bias. And again, those are things that I check within myself daily because I want to make sure that I'm always presenting myself as a fair individual to not only my students but their parents, other um, other members of the staff that I work with, my coworkers, other community members. We're a Title I school, so we're always involved with our community in our outreach. And so these are things that you just, like Connie said, you just kind of want to do those self reflections daily so that you're aware of what you're putting out to others.
So a couple minutes left. I usually like to close out with book or TV or movie recommendations. I've got a couple. So we have this ethos in American society, the American dream, that people can improve their station through hard work, and it's a great ideal, but I think it is often true that it requires more than that, and in a lot of cases. So a couple of books I've read about folks who just kind of toiled, worked very hard, multiple jobs, low wage, and they're just one bill away from everything falling apart, and doesn't necessarily always work out well for them. So one is Made by Stephanie Land, MAID, about a woman who does housekeeping to raise her child, and tries to go to school and become a writer, and ended up in the end being successful. But very hard road and very good read. Barbara Ehrenreich also has written a couple of books. She went undercover as a low-wage worker in Nickel and Dimed, and then as an out-of-work white-collar worker in Bait and Switch. Those are both very eye-opening. And then the last one I'll recommend is Hand to Mouth, Living in Bootstrap America by Linda Tirado, who tells stories about a lot of folks just living on a shoestring budget and what that's like day to day. So turn it over to you two for final thoughts, recommendations, anything you want to say.
I think for recommendations, I definitely recommend Reservation Dogs. It's on Hulu or FX Network, whichever one you actually have a subscription to, and it's written by Native people, and it was written through the eyes of just being an Indigenous kid on the reservation. And the thing that I love about it so much is that it's very much it's very accurate for a lot of people, like me, who grew up in on the reservation around their extended families. And I think that it's such a great introduction into reservation life. I know that a lot of what people see is what I call poverty porn. You see the economic disparities, you see the crumbling houses and infrastructure. But even still, those are very much real. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. It's also important to realize that there is a lot of beauty and there is a lot of success within our communities as well. And there's a lot of humor, and it's a lot of fun humor. So I definitely suggest Reservation Dogs. And also another good one would be Rutherford Falls, even though it just got canceled. So boo on them. But it's also a really good look of a Native woman who goes off, gets her education outside her community and comes home and is trying to do some good, and the challenges that she faces while doing that. So that's also a very interesting one to look at. And also, if you are able, if you see sometimes there's little short films that pop up occasionally from the Indigenous Film Festival that goes on every year. I can drop some of those in the chat, but a lot of them are just really beautiful pieces of work about community, about home and familial relationships. So, it's all out there, and a lot of the work is really beautiful. So definitely suggest a lot of that stuff.
So I was going through my Goodreads to try to find some book recommendations that weren't academic in nature per se, but one that may be of interest to this group because we are attorneys is the book, let me see, hold on, The Schoolhouse Gate by Justin Driver. He sort of looks at the public education system and how the Supreme Court has made decisions about different issues that impact public education within the United States. So that may be of interest to some of you. And just in terms of things you can watch, it's going to sound silly, but Abbott Elementary is probably one of my favorite newest shows that is out. So yes, it's a comedy, but many of those things are a reflection of what happens in the education system and happens in the classroom. I probably have seen every scenario that has played out on TV in those episodes. I probably have seen actually happen in the classroom. So it's a little lighthearted, but it can, make you laugh while also looking at some very real issues that we face within our education system here in the United States.
Great. Well, thanks for that. Thanks for everyone who attended, and thanks to our panelists. This has been very informative. Feel free to stick around for the social hour.